the Women Against Military Madness Solidarity Committee on the Americas. Thanks for coming to another Saturday morning coffee hour. I hope you all have your coffee. And which we've called our elections in Latin America indicative of a new pink tide. Let's see here, I'm losing my place. It goes without saying that we're looking forward for all kind of reasons, obviously, to being able to be together again at 4,200. But I guess if there's any, I hate to even say this, silver lining to this terrible time, it is wonderful to be able to get people like Leonardo at the drop of a hat, kind of, and for you to all be able to come to, no matter where you are, to our webinars. And I want to thank Emma Schroen for once again being the tech guru that she is, and she's always so amenable and competent, and because of that, this will be an incredible experience, I'm sure. We're also streaming on Facebook and on YouTube, and it will be recorded in both places, so you'll be able to share that after, or you could share it during this time if you're on those, or you could share from this site too, and watch it afterwards and share it afterwards. So we encourage you to do that because this is really important information. And it is because it seems to be another historic time in Latin America with elections that just happened for the National Assembly in Venezuela. Even the PSUV, the leading party of Venezuela, and Maduro's party, 67% of the seats. And again, a mandate to continue building and protecting their socialist society. Also and this is in spite of ongoing and persistent and draconian intervention by the US over the last 20 years. Actually going back to the 1800s, but intensely for the last 20 years. And at the same time in Bolivia in October, there were elections when the Bolivians threw out a right-wing coup government and brought in their MAS party again. And of course, there have been mass protests in Chile and in Peru. And I think we'll hear more about this, but I think Bolsonaro actually took a hit too in municipal elections recently. So we are really lucky to have somebody who knows this region well be with us and to talk about this time. One thing I want to tell you is that you're going to be muted the whole time, but we want you to we really want you to ask questions and put them in chat. And if you're on Facebook or YouTube, you can also put your questions there. So we will make sure that they're answered. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Penny Gardner, who is also a member of the committee and who will introduce Leonardo and do the land acknowledgement. And then we'll go on to the program, which will be an hour.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So Badote is a Dakota word that generally means where the two waters come together. The Badote, where Hahatanka, River of the Waterfall, or Wakpatanka, Big River, called the Mississippi River in English, and the Minnesota, Wakpa, Minnesota River come together, is central to Dakota spirituality and history. Badote is a place that carries a complicated and layered history. In the thousands of years, the Dakota people have been in relationship and kinship with the land here, and in several hundred years since European settlers colonized the land that the state of Minnesota now occupies. The United States land seizures were a project of spiritual destruction that denied the Dakota free and unhindered access to the land that fundamentally shapes their identity and spirituality. Today, 11 reservations are located within the state of Minnesota, 4 Dakota communities in the southern portion of the state, and 7 Ojibwe communities in the north. WAM pays tribute to the Dakota and the Ojibwe. We invite you to consider the land on which you live and the confluence of legacies that bring you to stand where you are, particularly through critical reflection and conversation with your own community. And I would like to now introduce our speaker for today, Leonardo Flores. Mr. Flores is the Latin America campaign coordinator with CODEPINK. Prior to that, he was senior policy analyst at the Venezuelan Embassy in Washington, D.C. He maintains close ties to social movements in Venezuela. Leonardo, welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to WAM for having me. And it's always really great to be able to talk directly to activists who have such a profound commitment to peace.
So I'll start off with a series of questions, or with one question, and Sarah and I are going to alternate asking the questions. But we'd like to know, is there a resurgence of the pink tide in Latin America? And compare this with the previous pink tide.
So let me talk about the original pink tide a little bit first. So that refers to kind of a period in the early 2000s up until the early mid 2010s, when there were a series of left governments in Latin America, including in Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Cuba, of course, Dominican Republic, Honduras, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, a lot of countries were all led by these left governments, progressive governments throughout the region, all at the same time. So that was a very historic moment. And of course, what was happening here in the US at the time was the Bush administration, which was more focused on other areas of the world than Latin America. So Latin America wasn't kind of under the gaze of empire for this period as much as it had been in the past. And that allowed a lot of these governments to come together to push for more regional integration. And many of them were voted in as a direct reaction to neoliberalism, which has failed spectacularly in Latin America. We'll talk a bit more about that. But these left governments all had certain things in common. And one of them was that they all experienced this kind of mass decrease in poverty and inequality. Latin America as a whole, the people of Latin America were much better off because of these governments. They came together to reject the FTAA, the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, which would have been kind of a NAFTA style agreement for the entire region, and really would have been a disaster for the environment and human rights and labor rights as well. And yeah, as I mentioned, they were all committed to regional integration. So they created a lot of new multilateral organizations. These included ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of the Americas, which is not a free trade organization, but a kind of more of a fair trade, a people's trade organization, in which there are several countries. At the height of it, I think it was something like 9 or 10, if not a little more, and now it's down a bit, but it's still kind of an important avenue for trade, especially in countries that are experiencing sanctions, such as Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. They also created the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Countries, which was meant to be a substitute to the OAS, the Organization of American States. The OAS, of course, is kind of a tool of the State Department of American imperialism, and it's functioned like that since it was created back in the 50s. And then there was also UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. This was really the kind of a stepping stone to push towards South American integration, kind of in the EU type style. And this particular organization played a very important role. For example, in 2008 in Bolivia, there was a coup attempt and a massacre by basically right-wing paramilitary thugs who massacred members of an indigenous community. And there were some very tense days in Bolivia where it was, thought that maybe the government of then President Evo Morales would fall. But UNASUR stepped in, and also I should note there was kind of a separatist movement in Bolivia that they want to break away the eastern departments or provinces of the country and create a new country. UNASUR stepped in and said, no, we're going to respect territorial integrity. We're going to investigate the massacre that took place, and we're going to calm the situation. And they did. UNASUR at the time was led by the then president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, who's now the head of the she's the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN. And so it was really, really important. This was a huge test for UNASUR to bring stability back to Bolivia, and it passed with flying colors, right? And so then, of course, when, success after the Obama and Trump administrations really tried to go after UNASUR and splinter it, and they managed to do that. I'll get into that a little bit more later. So basically, that was the experience of the pink tide, of course, and it starts receding during the during the Obama administration and at the beginning of the Trump administration. So one of the reasons it starts receding is because we have several coups in the region. For example, there's a coup in Honduras in 2009. There was a parliamentary coup in 2012 in Paraguay where the president was, it seems like he was kind of illegally stripped from office from the parliament. Of course, there was the coup in Brazil against Dilma, which occurred during both. It started during the Obama administration and was finalized during the early days of the. No, excuse me, that one took place entirely during the Obama administration. And then there were electoral defeats in Argentina, in El Salvador, and in Uruguay, and a kind of a bait and switch type situation in Ecuador, where we thought that the person who was going to succeed Correa, whose name is Lenin Moreno, was going to continue with what they call the citizens' revolution, but instead he took a total right-wing neoliberal turn, destroyed much of what was of the progress that Ecuador had achieved in the years under Correa, and he started persecuting Correa and his allies politically. And that was really, all of this that I'm speaking about was really kind of a strategy, a deliberate strategy during the Obama administration to splinter this block of countries. And it was partially successful, of course, because at one point in the past few years, there were only kind of 3 or 4 left countries left, with Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and then Bolivia. And then, of course, Bolivia fell in the coup in 2019. Now we talk kind of about a new pink tide surging, and it starts with the election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico. He is, a progressive. I mean, if you talk to leftists in Mexico, some of them will have very strong criticisms of him. But from my perspective, the thing I really like about AMLO is the kind of the foreign policy positions that he's taken. So he strongly committed to Venezuela's sovereignty, which is really important because we're talking, when he was elected, this is right when the Lima Group is this ad hoc group of countries that came together when it couldn't win a vote at the OAS against Venezuela. So they decided to form this kind of what they call a multilateral organization, but really it's kind of an ad hoc group that began pressuring Venezuela and pushing for regime change in Venezuela. And the hope was that Mexico would join this group, but Mexico did not, and they rejected it, and they were firmly on Venezuela's side and recognized President Maduro, which was really important because, as I said, you had all these right-wing governments come into power at once, and it seemed like all of Latin America, or much of it, was against Venezuela at this time. But Mexico held out, as did many small Caribbean countries that faced, immense pressure from the OAS and the State Department and people in Congress, including Marco Rubio, who threatened to cut off funds for these Caribbean countries unless they voted against Venezuela at the OAS. And many didn't, and they continue to have good relations with Venezuela. So with the election of López Obrador, it kind of opened up more space politically for the left in Latin America. And then that was followed by the election of Alberto Fernandez in Argentina after years of terrible economic mismanagement by the neoliberals and Mauricio Macri in that country. And then last year, you had the election of Luis Arce of the MAS in Bolivia, retaking power after the horrible coup and the coup regime that committed, so that systematically violated human rights and committed 2 horrible massacres in the towns of Secata and Sacaba. And so that was kind of like, the first kind of electoral push of a new pink tide. But really, I would say that this new pink tide goes beyond this political or these political parties taking power, and it's really about social movements, right? Because the pink tide, it goes beyond national governments as well. There were massive social movements supporting all of these governments. So the FTAA, the fact that it was defeated, it wasn't just because Chavez and Lula in Brazil and Kirchner in Argentina were against it, but it was because there were hundreds of thousands of people that took to the streets marching against it, and there was a huge push from below to reject it, and it was successful. And we're seeing, or at least we had been seeing until the pandemic, a similar rise in social movements throughout the region. And you talked about it a little bit. We saw in late 2019 massive protests in Chile, mass protests in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Haiti, and then more recently we saw mass protests in Peru. So, I mean, from my perspective, when we talk about this new pink tide that's appears to be surging in Latin America, we can't stop the conversation just at the governments. We also have to include these social movements because in some cases, it's not clear that they're going to be able to take power. So for example, in Colombia, the Colombian left had a historic turnout and historic number of votes in the 2018 presidential elections, and they still lost, and they lost by like 5 or 6 points. And then in 2019, Colombia had municipal elections, and they did much better. The Colombian right headed by Ivan Duque and Álvaro Uribe, who are, basically as right-wing as you can get in Latin America. They were defeated handily in these mayoral elections. And so there is kind of the possibility that Colombia might kind of join this pink tide. But even if they don't, the fact that people are out on the streets, the fact that there's so many different social movements coming together within Colombia, you have peasant movements, you have youth movements, you have labor movements, and they're all working together as one, which is, about time. Yeah, we're glad that they are. I think that's going to, put a lot of pressure on the Colombian right wing, and it's going to make them seek stability in the future rather than this kind of strategy of the regime change they have for Venezuela. So yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see really important elections coming up this year in Latin America. We have got elections in I have this list somewhere. Ecuador. Well, we have elections in Ecuador. We have elections in Chile. There's going to be elections in Brazil in 2022. So, I think there is a lot of space for this new pink tide, and what we'll hopefully see is a return to integration. Because one of the really interesting things about this movement towards integration, when the pink tide came about, is that the right-wing countries were also brought into the fold, and they didn't really object to it, right? So Colombia, for example, Chile, Peru, they all were led by right-wing governments at different times during the pink tide. And they all were part of CELAC and UNASUR, and they saw it as an important space for regional integration and unity and tackling the region's problems without outside interference. Again, as as a direct result of the strategy by the Obama and Trump administrations, a lot of these countries kind of peeled off from those multilateral organizations. But there is the possibility that they'll rejoin them, and I think that will be very telling of whether or not the pink tide will be successful. So I think success for this new pink tide isn't going to be measured just in terms of how well they do for their own people, but how well they kind of reconstruct and build the foundations for these new multilateral institutions to ensure that the region, despite having countries with different ideologies, to ensure that the region will be able to kind of take care of its own problems, basically.
Thank you, Leonardo. That was an incredible, comprehensive overview, both of the former pink tide and the hope for the new one. It was really, really good. Thank you. And now to circle back to Venezuela a little bit, and that election. So this is about the Venezuelan elections, and I have several points maybe to cover on that. First of all, the electoral process in Venezuela is often referred to as one of, if not the freest, fairest, and most open in the world. If you could kind of describe what that is and why they can count their votes in a day, and it takes us weeks to do it. To say something about the parties, including the leading parties in Venezuela. Now, to discuss the results of the election and what those results mean, both for the people of Venezuela as well as the U.S. hegemonic agenda.
Sure. So, I mean, that phrase "best in the world," it actually comes from Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter, in I think it was 2012, he described the Venezuelan electoral process as the best in the world because Venezuela uses electronic voting machines backed by paper receipts. So let me kind of walk you through what a voter goes through in Venezuela's election day. You come to the voting poll, you see where what we call voting tables. There's a big voting precinct basically, where there are lists outside the precinct telling you what table to go to. You go to that table based on your name and your ID number. And then once it's your turn to vote, you present your ID to a poll worker. Because of COVID this time around, there was no kind of direct touching, but so you would just place your ID on a table and nobody touched it other than yourself as a biosecurity measure. The poll worker sees your ID, verifies that it's you. And I should note right off the bat that in Venezuela, basically everybody has a national ID. It's something you can't really live in Venezuela without when kids get them when they're 12 years old. And we don't have this problem of having eligible people to vote who aren't registered. If you're eligible to vote in Venezuela, I think there's 97% or higher of the people who are eligible to vote are registered to vote. So I should have started with that. Anyway, you place your ID on the table, your identity gets verified. Then you place your thumbprint or your thumb on this kind of scanner that checks your thumb. If your thumbprint is verified, and again, that's part of the ID system, that unlocks the voting machine. So already you have at least two systems in place, this kind of verification by the poll worker and verification by a machine to prevent kind of people from voting twice. So that's like the first fraud prevention measure. Then you go to the voting machine, right? The voting machine, they were actually all destroyed in, I think it was early 2020 in what seems to be an arson attack on the warehouse of the CNE, the National Electoral Council in Venezuela, the highest electoral authority. So in this past year, Venezuela had to build like something like 14,000, I think I might have the number wrong, new voting machines, but they managed to do it. So these voting machines are all digital, they're electronic, and it's pretty simple to vote. It takes about 10 seconds to vote. You mark your choices on the screen, you hit enter, and it prints a paper receipt. So at that point, you take the paper receipt, you verify that you've correctly marked what you pressed, and then you get the paper receipt and you place it in a secure ballot box. After that, you sign your name on the voter roll, you place your thumbprint on the voter roll, again, to prevent, sorts of fraud, and then that's it, your vote is done, you leave. After the election process is over, once polls have closed, there's an immediate digital count of the electronic vote. This digital tally is then verified by taking the secure ballot boxes, opening them, and this is all done in public in front of representatives from every party that wants to be there and in front of any citizen who wants to be there. The ballot boxes are open, the paper receipts are counted, that count is matched to the digital count. In almost every case, the count is perfect. There are some cases where you might have fewer votes in the ballot box because people didn't put their voting receipts in. And in that case, there are further audits to make sure nothing else happened. But so this happens immediately on election night. 54%, there's a random sampling of 54% of these ballot boxes that are opened and checked with the corresponding machines. That's a number that's much higher than statistically necessary to obtain a valid, trustworthy result. On several occasions, it's been pushed up to 100% audit when there's been, concerns, and really, there haven't been actual concerns. It's more like the opposition saying fraud without any proof. And then, so then, you have this vote count that once this audit is which is known as the citizens audit is concluded, the electoral authorities announce the results. They did that on the night of the elections at around midnight, 12:30, maybe slightly later. I think this time around, it all went a little slower because of COVID, of course, and there were the biosecurity measures slowed the whole counting process down. That's why it was maybe like 1 or 2 hours later than normal. So, it's a voting system that has a lot of redundancies in it. It's got 16 different audits that to back it up. I'll put a link to so you can see this, what the audit system is in the chat. And so, it's a system that is like verifiable and secure, and it's meant to build trust in the whole process. And I think it generally has done that. Where it's failed in the sense that people the Venezuelan opposition, every time they lose elections, they say that it's going to be they say it's because of fraud. The one time they didn't lose elections, they didn't say anything about the electoral system. They welcomed the results. And that was back in 2015 when they took the National Assembly. But so for these elections, I'll get into the topic of the parties a little bit. There were 14,000 candidates from 107 parties. 97 of those parties opposed the Maduro government. And the choices ran the ideological spectrum from communists and socialists to evangelicals, Christian conservatives, neoliberals, a wide spectrum of ideologies, much more choice in terms of parties than say what we have here in the US, where we're, for better or worse, limited to 2 parties with other smaller parties that unfortunately don't really have a chance of winning. And it's a system, and this time around, I think there's always a criticism of the government because it has this kind of advantage of being the incumbent. I think that the incumbent advantage is something that happens in every election, but the thing in Venezuela is it gets bigger because, of course, you have the Socialist Party winning election after election. I think in Venezuela now there's been, I want to say that it's been 26 electoral processes in the past 20 years. And of those, I would say the socialists have won roughly 24 of them, depending how you count. So, it's clearly there's a significant base of popular support for President Maduro and his party. And in this election, unfortunately, you had what we call the extremist opposition. So let me backtrack a little bit. In Venezuela, the opposition to the government is really a huge tent, right? It's a big coalition. The only thing they have in common is that they don't like the Maduro government. I mean, that's about it. Within that opposition, there's all sorts of people. You have centrists, you have neoliberals, you have neocons, you have outright fascists, right? And now there's been, in the last 3 years or so, a new split in the opposition between those that think they can take power by force or by outside pressure, led basically by Juan Guaido, the person who self-proclaimed himself president in January 2019 with the support of the United States and US allies. And you have another side of the opposition, what we call the moderate opposition, that wants to play politics and that wants to engage in politics and wants to engage in democracy, and that thinks that elections are the only way forward for Venezuela. And obviously, I think that's that's what the opposition has to do, because otherwise Venezuela is going to be thrown into turmoil. These moderates, they ran in the elections. They're the ones that made up these 97 parties that oppose Maduro. They got trounced, and they got trounced in part because the extremist opposition called for a partial boycott. So, you have an opposition in Venezuela that routinely claims that they have 80% of the support of the people. Why would you call for a boycott of the vote if you have 80% of support? It's pretty clear to me that they don't have anything near 80% of the vote. And so one of the reasons, in my opinion, as to why they boycotted was because the last time they fully participated in elections was in 2017, when Venezuela held nationwide gubernatorial elections. At that point in time, the opposition was saying, we're going to consider these elections a referendum on Maduro. If we take the majority of governorships, Maduro has to resign. There's nothing in the law that states that, but that's what they were saying before the elections. And they were saying they were going to win 20 out of the 23 states. What happened on election day was that the opposite happened. Maduro's party won in 19 of 23 states. It was a total sweep, and it was a disaster for the opposition. And since then, they've been boycotting elections as a strategy, or at least this faction has. And so that's really one of the big reasons they boycotted, was because they thought they couldn't win. If they had lost the majority in the national election, and if they had participated and lost, then it would have been absolutely the end of the Juan Guaido experiment, because his so-called legitimacy stems from the fact that he was an elected member of the National Assembly, and then he was the president of the National Assembly. So that's where his, the kind of fake legitimacy that they endow upon, the U.S. endows upon Guaido, is based on the fact that he was the president of the National Assembly and declared himself the interim president of the country. So, if he'd won and not taken the majority, he wouldn't have been the president of the National Assembly anymore, and he would just have been a regular parliamentarian, and the whole kind of farce, this whole edifice that has been built up by the United States and its allies, would have collapsed. So it made more sense from Guaido's point of view not to run than run and risk losing. Of course, the other big thing is that the U.S., pressured these candidates not to run. Well, we can talk more about that in a little bit. But, the upshot of it is that, of what the results mean, is that, you have the Maduro, the PSUV, this coalition that supports the PSUV, because it's not just the PSUV, it's the PSUV and several other smaller parties. They're in power in the National Assembly. They have a supermajority in the National Assembly. And that's going to be crucial for the Maduro government to be able to have legislators who are going to support him in finding ways around the sanctions. So the sanctions, of course, have really been incredibly brutal. They've caused Venezuela's income to fall by 99%. They've devastated the economy. They've cost anywhere between 40,000 to 100,000 lives. And now you're going to have a National Assembly that, instead of its leaders calling for sanctions and coups and in military intervention, as Juan Guaido and his allies have done, you have this National Assembly that's going to work with the president and the executive in finding ways of overcoming the sanctions. So I think that's really the main thing to take out of the results on Sunday.
Well, thank you for that comprehensive answer to Sarah's question. Following up about influence on the election, we're wondering if are you aware of any attempts by the United States government to influence the government or the elections? And you did say that there was encouragement to the opposition to boycott. Could you talk a little bit about that and about what the U.S. hopes to achieve by encouraging the boycott?
Sure. So, one of the things we know about the US strategy in Venezuela is that they're out to subvert the Maduro government, and they're also out to kind of set this narrative that Venezuela is not a democracy. And they've been working on that for 20 years. And let me just go back before talking about the elections that just happened and go back and talk a little bit about 2017, 2018. At the end of 2017, through, I think it was something like November through late January 2017, 2018, the Venezuelan opposition and government were engaged in talks in the Dominican Republic. These talks went really far in terms of coming up with a comprehensive agreement for peace and stability in the region, and involved everything from the economy to the National Electoral Council to how to the Supreme Court. It was comprehensive. After several months of negotiations, they have this final document, and then they leave the Dominican Republic for a week to consult with parties and back home in Venezuela. But the idea is that this is happening. This agreement was going to happen, and nobody thought that within that interim week it would be sabotaged. What happened in that interim week is that the Trump administration, Rex Tillerson, the then Secretary of State, goes on record saying two things. One is that he's going to consider an oil embargo in Venezuela. The second is that if the military were to undertake a coup in Venezuela, the U.S. would look kindly upon that. And then you had Marco Rubio, threaten. I think it was Rubio threatened military action against in Venezuela. So these were kind of outward signs of where the U.S. government stood in terms of this peace process, this negotiation that was happening. And it came as no surprise after these declarations that the opposition came back to the table and then presented a totally different kind of plan that they wanted to implement right away. And it was a non-starter, and everything fell apart. So the Trump administration was directly involved in sabotaging this peace plan. Why would they do that? Because they knew that in 2018, Venezuela was going to have presidential elections, and they didn't want Maduro to run in those elections. So they were trying to find a different way out. There was no way out for the US. So what they did then was, one last thing. The other thing the United States did in this interim between, having the negotiators in the Dominican Republic go to Venezuela and come back, was that they said they wouldn't recognize elections in Venezuela in 2018, the presidential elections. That was before the election date had been set. It was obviously before any candidates had announced they were running, besides Maduro, who was obviously going to run. And it was a sign to the opposition saying, don't bother running in these elections. We're not going to recognize you. And one of the leaders of Acción Democrática, Democratic Action, which is one of the traditional parties in Venezuela that held power and alternated power with a different party between 1950 and 1998. They were they're one of the big players. The leader of that party basically told the press, why would I run in these elections if the United States won't recognize it? So already you have this kind of this tendency or this strategy in place from the United States to undermine elections by not recognizing them and by declaring them to be fraudulent before they're even held. The same thing happened this time around in the legislative elections. The US State Department has spent the last 3 or 4 months saying that no, those are going to be totally fraudulent elections, they're going to be a sham, presented no evidence as to why they thought they were going to be a sham. They routinely said that the conditions weren't set on the ground to have free and fair elections, but they never said what those conditions were, right? For them, the only condition really for Venezuela to engage in dialogue with the US government and for the sanctions to be lifted is for President Maduro to resign, which is obviously kind of a non-starter. So what happened then another thing that happened in this run up to the elections is that the US began sanctioning members of the opposition. This hadn't happened before until roughly kind of August 2020, when the U.S. started sanctioning these members of the opposition who broke with the Guaido faction and engaged in dialogue with the Maduro government and said that they were going to run for elections. Unfortunately, it wasn't just the U.S. The EU, got in on this plan too. They also sanctioned opposition leaders. And what's worse in my mind is that you had Enrique Capriles, who is this opposition leader. He ran and lost twice in presidential elections in 2012 and 2013. At one point, he was kind of the darling of the U.S. political establishment until his star kind of faded and was overtaken by Leopoldo Lopez, who's really an outright fascist. Capriles told the EU, he said, listen, if the EU comes and monitors, I'm going to run in these elections and I'm going to urge my party to run in these elections. Unfortunately, the EU refused to do that. Capriles made the request in September. Already by that point, the Maduro government had invited the EU to monitor the elections. The EU said no, there wasn't enough time. This was 3 months before the elections, and the EU was saying there wasn't enough time to set up a team and go to Venezuela, which is totally ridiculous. So, you have the EU and the US undermining Venezuela's elections by saying that they're, basically fraudulent without offering any proof. And what we know is that claiming that elections are fraudulent before they're even held, and then insisting that fraud occurred in the face of overwhelming evidence against such a claim, that's a specialty of the Trump administration. We've already seen what happened, like Trump do the exact same thing here with our own elections. And in Venezuela, just like here, there was absolutely no evidence of fraud. So yeah, that's how the US attempted to influence these elections in Venezuela.
Thanks. Before we go on to a discussion about Bolivia, we have a couple or questions that Emma's going to ask, and also encourage people to go ahead and ask questions in chat or, on Facebook or YouTube. So Emma.
Hey, everybody. I'm Emma, just popping in now to ask a couple of questions. We only have a couple of questions at this point, so don't hesitate if you have a question to ask on whatever platform you're watching this on right now. And if you are watching a live stream of it on YouTube or Facebook or Periscope, please share it if you haven't already, so we can reach a few more people. And even though we only have a couple of questions, I usually think that means that our speaker is doing a really good job of explaining everything and isn't leaving too many things out. But so far, what we've got, Leonardo, could you say more about the breakdown of the first wave of the pink tide? What were some of its weaknesses that could be altered this time?
And should we take all the questions at once, or should I answer that one first?
I can ask you the next one also if you'd like.
Sure.
Okay. With this new wave of the pink tide, what do you think solidarity in the US should look like?
Okay, so the breakdown of the first wave, what were its weaknesses? I mean, it's tough, right? Because every country is different. But I think one of its weaknesses is that many of these governments didn't go far enough in terms of radically restructuring their institutions. So in Brazil, you have, President Lula, who's still wildly popular, and then followed by Dilma, who was popular, but then she was subverted by the Obama administration. And I'll just briefly go into that. The Department of Justice helped out this Brazilian prosecutor who was trying to take down Dilma through a kind of an unconnected corruption investigation called Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash. And there's evidence that was, published by The Intercept showing how the DOJ under Obama really helped bring Dilma down. But basically, so for example, in Brazil, you still have this state that had been controlled by basically neoliberals and that had not just been controlled, but they're the ones that established it after the military dictatorship in Brazil. And there weren't kind of enough avenues for people and for movements from below to push what they wanted for. So that happens in Brazil, of course. Then you have the rise of Bolsonaro. I think the weakness is it's really hard to generalize, as I said, because it's very different in each country. So for example, and there are also kind of several betrayals. So I think I mentioned the one in Ecuador, but another betrayal happened in El Salvador, where you have Nayib Bukele, the president there. He used to belong to the FMLN party. And then there was kind of a split, temporary split within the FMLN. You had basically these people who were basically taking advantage of the party name and were really neoliberals or quasi-fascists like Bukele. And they managed to kind of put into the narrative within the country that the FMLN were somehow corrupt. And as I said, even though I said before it's hard to generalize, I think I just hit the one point that really you can generalize. There was this narrative put in place throughout the hemisphere that the left was corrupt. And so you had accusations of corruption against the FMLN in El Salvador, and of course in Brazil, again, Ecuador, almost everywhere there were these accusations of corruption. Many cases they're unfounded, in some cases they're overblown, and in any case, what we have to understand is that Latin American governments have a long history of being really corrupt. So it was nothing new, but it was something that the right wing was able to kind of pounce upon and use to their advantage, this issue of corruption. And then obviously what we saw when, you had the right wing surge throughout the hemisphere is that corruption didn't stop, it actually got worse. So I think that's one of the weaknesses of the movement is addressing issues of corruption, and really I think the media played a huge role, of course, because you have these media interests who are always against people's movements, who are against progressive governments. And although you had, something like you had Telesur rise, it wasn't enough. Telesur is great, but it wasn't enough. It didn't get enough viewership, and really just, you can't just have one media outlet be the voice of, the people throughout the hemisphere. You have to have, kind of a critical mass, and more people's media come to the forefront. When we talk about Bolivia, I'll talk a little bit about the role of people's media there. But yeah, I think those are the weaknesses of the pink tide. And okay, and the other question was, oh, the new pink tide wave in solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, so yeah, the role of solidarity. I mean, I think it's tough, right? Because it's going to be hard for social movements to pressure the Biden administration directly. But one of the things we're going to see is that the Biden administration can be pressured through Congress. And so I think the role of us here in the US is to pressure Congress and to talk to our own representatives about, basically I would say three things. One, with non-interference in the affairs of Latin America. Two is, cooperation rather than competition. And three is, just having respect generally. I think during the Trump administration, we saw kind of a lot of awful rhetoric about Latin Americans and Latin American countries, and that obviously has to end. And we have to have, just treat each other with more respect. But and I think one of the big challenges too, and obviously this only really applies to Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, is the issue of sanctions. And I think the solidarity movement can have a big impact there, because there's more and more evidence that sanctions have devastating humanitarian costs, that they kill people, sanctions kill. And I think that's, we had a couple of bills in Congress during this last couple of years try to address that. They failed. But the fact that even in Congress there's a conversation of about sanctions is something really important that solidarity groups have to take advantage of.
Thanks, Leonardo. Another really great answer, comprehensive. I'm learning a tremendous amount, and I actually follow this part of the world. So, and you mentioned Bolivia. Go ahead and talk more about what has happened and is happening in Bolivia.
Sure. So, I mean, as you all know, there was a coup in Bolivia in November 2019. And what happened was that in October 2019, there were elections in Bolivia, and they were free and fair elections, but the OAS was monitoring those elections. And then they used this this claim of fraud to set this narrative that there was fraud in the elections, and that led to the coup in Bolivia. So the OAS was basically saying that, in Bolivia, they can have up to 2 rounds of elections, presidential elections. In the first round, if a candidate either wins 50% or wins by at least 10, then there's no need for a second round. In Bolivia, there was what they call a quick count system, where they quickly counted the ballots and then they were going to count them and audit them afterwards. And this quick count system, it had Evo Morales leading by about 7 or 8 points, at night, with 80% of the vote in. What happened was that there wasn't a random sampling of this quick count. So they overcounted, or rather, they counted a lot of the urban vote, and they ignored a lot of the rural vote. So when this last 20% of the vote came in, it went overwhelmingly for Morales, and he went from 7%, being 7% ahead, to winning by about 11 points. The OAS said there was fraud here. It was immediately debunked by many electoral experts, including by CEPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research, a think tank here in DC. But, unfortunately, the OAS has much more power than CEPR. So the OAS was really able to impose its will on Bolivia, and that directly led to the coup. And I mentioned the systematic abuses of human rights by the Añez coup regime and the massacres. And then the Añez regime did something, horrible, which was that they kept postponing elections. They were supposed to be in power throughout, according to the law. Obviously, the law was suspended at that point, pretty much. But they were supposed to be only an interim government in power for about 3 months. But they kept postponing elections. They kept finding different reasons to postpone the elections. The first was that they had to have a completely new electoral authority. And then they started using the pandemic as an excuse. But what happened in Bolivia was that social movements started coming out onto the streets, right? They didn't come out onto the streets when the coup happened because they were held back a bit by the party, by the MAS party of Evo Morales, because at that point, the parties thought that they could keep things under control. They didn't really see the coup coming as quickly as it did. And they didn't want people on the streets because they feared violence, and maybe rightly so. But anyway, the social movements decided, after the Áñez government started postponing elections again, that enough was enough. And you had hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets in Bolivia in July and August. They blocked the streets, they paralyzed the country, and they forced the Áñez regime to set a binding date for the elections. Those elections were in October. And then the MAS totally won in a landslide. They won 55% of the vote. They won by 27 points. They voted against a neoliberal party, and they voted against a fascist white supremacist party. But really, it was people power on the streets that took down the regime, and that to me was, gave me a lot of hope for the rest of the region and in the elections that we're going to see upcoming in 2021.
Great, thank you for that clarification. And you talked about what solidarity could look like in the Biden administration in reference to the Congress, influencing Congress. What do you think the Biden election will mean for policies in Latin America?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm one of those people who didn't see much difference between Trump and Biden, but there are marginal differences, and those margins are important. So let me just briefly talk about what Trump meant for Latin America. The first thing is, obviously, you have these maximum pressure campaigns against Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and you had this very anti-socialist rhetoric. And this wasn't just in 2020, this was in 2016 as well. Part of his stump speech in 2016 in Venezuela was part of Trump's stump speech in the US elections in 2016 included Venezuela. He routinely mentioned it as the path we don't want to take for the US. It was really kind of aimed at the Bernie Sanders and that movement. But it went beyond that because it was also aimed at donors and votes in South Florida, Cuban American, Venezuelan American votes. So I don't think we're going to see that same sort of rhetoric against these three countries coming from the Biden camp, and we're certainly not going to see such explicit anti-socialist rhetoric coming from the Biden camp. Another thing about Trump was that he's not really susceptible to pressure or shame in certain ways. So he was really able to kind of get away with being really close to Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, to Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, and to Bukele in El Salvador in ways that Biden is not going to be able to. Because Biden, if he were to do that, he would pay a political price, not just from getting pressure from Congress, but also from the media. And so Trump was someone, while the New York Times didn't really influence Trump in the sense that they could run stories about how awful Bolsonaro was and why Trump shouldn't go there. If the New York Times does the same thing with Biden, then Biden's really going to pay attention. So already you're going to have this kind of split between the US and the ultra right in Latin America. And it's not going to be a complete split, but it's going to be kind of the relations are not going to be as close as they were before. Another key element, I think, is that Trump would have been much more likely to use force in Latin America. We saw that with the deployment of the fleet to Venezuela, to just outside Venezuelan waters. This is, we're talking about the largest U.S. deployment in Latin America since the 1989 invasion of Panama. So it was really kind of a major thing. And related to that is that I don't think we're going to see from the Biden administration as much support for covert operations or paramilitary attacks. And when I mention that, and when I say that, I mean, in Venezuela specifically, we've had a lot of these sorts of attacks occur in the past 3 years. So in 2018, there was an assassination by drone attempt against President Maduro, various terror and paramilitary attacks. All of these stemmed from Colombia. The United States certainly knew about all of them. I think, obviously the biggest one was what they call the Bay of Piglets, when U.S. mercenaries fought with Venezuelan deserters, tried to invade the country, and it failed spectacularly. But all of that came from Colombia. And my point is that I'm not so sure that Trump is going to either give the green light to that sort of thing from Colombia, and I don't think he's going to ignore it. So hopefully we'll see fewer of those attacks. And just yesterday in Venezuela, 2 people were captured carrying about 100 pounds of C4. They were going to bomb a refinery, and they came directly from Colombia. And just yesterday, also, the president of Colombia held a kind of a news conference with Leopoldo Lopez, the extreme fascist opposition leader who escaped from house arrest in Venezuela a couple of months ago. And Duque, the president, said that Colombia helped him escape. So that sort of sabotage coming directly from a NATO country, hopefully that's going to end. I'm not super convinced on that point, but I think that that's one of the areas where Biden is going to be different. And then just the role of like how Trump was able to bully countries in the region, I don't think Biden's going to be able to get away with that. So you had a lot of what are called third country safe agreements relating to immigration and asylum, where Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador were forced to have these basically camps for asylum seekers from other countries. And they were pressured into doing that by the Trump administration. I don't think Biden could get away with pressuring these countries in the same way. So what can we expect from Biden? I mean, I think on the one hand, in terms of Cuba, we're going to see a thawing of kind of the hostilities towards Cuba. I don't know if he's going to go as far as Obama went in terms of a total rapprochement. Hopefully there's going to be a push for that. But it's not clear at this point. I mean, a lot of his Latin America policy is still kind of obscure because he didn't want to go on the record with it during the campaign. In terms of Venezuela, he did I think they held one campaign event to talk about Venezuela. And his advisors basically said that they're going to continue Trump's policies. They didn't say it in those terms, of course, but they basically said that they're going to seek sanctions, international isolation, and try to build a coalition. Trump has done all of that, and all of that failed. So Biden has also said he really wants to address the humanitarian issue of the migrants coming from Venezuela. Really, the only way to do that is to lift the sanctions. I think it's pretty clear that there's a correlation between the sanctions and the outward flow of Venezuelan migrants. And so, I think that's one of the areas where I think we as solidarity groups can pressure him and be like, look, yeah, there are all these migrants in Colombia, in Ecuador, and other countries in Latin America who are suffering in part A, because of the pandemic, but also because it's difficult to be a migrant. The best way to help them is to get them home by lifting the sanctions on Venezuela and helping rebuild the Venezuelan economy. And in terms of Central America, I think it's going to be tough because Biden was really central to imposing this policy of what's called the Alliance for Prosperity, which is basically a neoliberal economic reforms for the entire region that favor transnational corporations to the detriment of homegrown corporations and to the detriment, of course, of workers. Biden also was instrumental in coming up with CARSI and CIBSI. CARSI is the Central American Regional Security Initiative. CIBSI is the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. So what we're seeing in Central America and the Caribbean is really the United States trying to impose its will through economic reforms and through increased militarization. And so that's going to be very dangerous for the region because what we know is that more militarization and more neoliberalism translate into more migration. Yeah, I think so. It's going to be tough, of course, because it's tough to predict what's going to happen with Biden, because a lot of it is also going to depend on what happens in 2021 with the elections in Latin America. If the left takes power in these several countries that are holding elections, that's going to put a lot of pressure on Biden to kind of have a rapprochement with Venezuela and Nicaragua as well. And so hopefully that's what we're going to see.
Thank you. We're about at the end of our time, I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this one in the time we have left, and I think we could probably go over a little, but the first part of the question is, excuse me, do you know of other solidarity movements with Latin America and Europe and other parts of the world? And also maybe this part first, because this kind of goes to what you were talking about. Could you speak to influence and our support from China, Russia, Iran, sending oil to Venezuela, and in terms of trade as a counterbalance to?
Sure. So when we talk about U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, generally we start talking about 2014-ish when there was a bill in Congress passed called something like the Venezuela Defense of Democracy and Civil Liberties Act. I think I just butchered the name of the bill, but 2014. But it actually goes back before that. During the Bush administration, Venezuela was sanctioned and prevented from buying U.S. weapons. Prior to Chavez, Venezuela was basically not just the client state of the United States, but it was its primary ally in the region. Venezuela always did what the United States said. They would sell oil at a discount to the United States. That's how, under control Venezuela was. And Venezuela almost basically all of its weapon systems came from the United States. So when Bush imposes that sanction, that forces Venezuela to seek alternatives. The obvious alternatives when it comes to weapons is Russia and China, because the sanctions also prohibited Venezuela from buying weapons that had US systems in it. So that, rules out other major players in weapon systems, including say like France or Norway or even Brazil. So you had this kind of closeness of relations with Russia and China, in part because Venezuela was forced to completely restructure its military, buying weapon systems and defense systems from these two countries. Also, Chavez's theory of anti-imperialism included this concept of what he calls a multipolar world. So obviously during the Cold War, we had a bipolar world, the US, NATO, and then the USSR. And now after the Cold War ended, we lived basically in a unipolar world for a bit. US is the global hegemon, nobody really coming close to compete. The idea Chavez had, and others, of course, idea he grabbed onto, is this multipolar world where you have various poles of power, and that way you have this balance of power throughout the world with no one country being able to dominate the others. One of the ways we saw this was, say, the formation of BRICS, this group of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That fell apart because of internal dynamics within, say, India and South Africa and other reasons. But that's kind of why, Venezuela sought alternatives to the United States. Those alternatives obviously being Russia and China primarily. Then, as Venezuela also started having closer relations to Iran, but that's not really super new because Venezuela and Iran are both founding members of OPEC, the oil cartel, the oil producing and exporting countries. And so they've had close ties since, I think, the 50s, basically, if not before. But the ties become closer, especially after the 2000 coup in Venezuela, which lasted about 48 hours or 72 hours and was backed by the US. When it became clear to Chavez and others that the US was intent on regime change in Venezuela, they started seeking out potential allies to help them. And obviously Iran, which has been a target of regime change for decades, for 40 years now, became a natural ally. And as the sanctions against Venezuela intensified, the same thing happened. You have Iran has this experience of living as a country under sanctions. So you had that tie, become stronger as well. And Venezuela has learned quite a bit about sanctions from its interactions with Iran. I think those were the three countries that were mentioned, right?
Yes, they were.
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, I think we just have a minute to talk about solidarity movements with Latin America and Europe and other parts of the world. And then Penny.
Sure. And so at CODEPINK, we've one of the things we're working on is what we're calling the good neighbor policy. I'm sure some of you remember the good neighbor policy from the FDR administration. It was a rejection of what had come before that, which was the Monroe Doctrine and gunboat diplomacy. The good neighbor policy basically had the principles of non-intervention and non-interference. It was back then, it was kind of a mixed bag because there are examples of the US interfering, say, for example, in the Dominican Republic under Roosevelt. But, I think it's kind of this positive message. It draws back on hundreds of years of US solidarity because it didn't start with FDR. It actually started in about the 1820s, this idea of a good neighbor, when the Latin American countries were struggling under Spanish colonialism, and there was a movement in the US to help these countries. It wasn't successful, but it was still there. And so we have this kind of 200-year history to draw on of solidarity between the US and Latin America. And we're kind of pushing this idea of a new good neighbor policy based on non-interference, mutual respect, and cooperation. And we got about 110 or so organizations to sign on to this letter asking for Biden to implement the new good neighbor policy. And that's going to be one of the focus of our work at CODEPINK at the Latin America team in the upcoming years, to build this into a coalition of a lot of different groups. And the idea is to focus first on groups in the United States, but then to expand it to have groups in Latin America say, yeah, that's what we want from the United States as well. So that's the main reason, the main method that we're going to be working for solidarity in the upcoming year.
Well, we are at the end of our time, and thank you so much, Leonardo, for joining us today. This was so informative, such good information. And I think we probably could have kept going longer because there's still a lot of information about Latin America that's of interest. But we thank you and hope you'll join us again.
I would love to. Thanks so much.
All right. Well, we'll keep you on our list for future events. And I just thank you so much. And everybody out there who is watching on another platform, please share the event. A lot of people would be interested in seeing this that did not join us today. So thanks again, Leonardo, and hope to see you in DC sometime.
Hope so.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This was a very nice, very good coffee hour. And I guess that's it. Thank you, Emma. And thank you, Sophia, for our tech help.